An unabridged recording of One Man's Plight by Michael L. McCoy. Copyright text 2017. Copyright audio recording 2023. The 28-hour recording of One Man's Plight is a fictional chronicle drawing heavily from other eras and distant locales. As the story proceeds, you'll hear of a fatherless child and his widowed mother, murderous men and their assassins, a picaresque saint wrestling with God's grace, a mysterious foreigner, a Christian or a traitor, an unbroken man crippled in his youth by a religious wretch, the budding and steadfast love of a man and woman, as well as the comings and goings of many others in this audio book. In The Cloister and the Hearth, Charles Reade reminds us, "Not a day passes over the earth, but men and women of no note do great deeds, speak great words, and suffer noble sorrows. Of these obscure heroes, philosophers, and martyrs, the greater part will never be known till that hour when many that are great shall be small, and the small great. But of others the world's knowledge may be said to sleep. Their lives and characters lie hidden from nations in the annals that record them. The general reader cannot feel them. They are presented so curtly and coldly. They are not like breathing stories appealing to his heart, but little historic hailstones striking him but to glance off his bosom. Nor can he understand them, for epitomes are not narratives, as skeletons are not human figures. Thus, records of prime truths remain a dead letter to plain folk. The writers have left so much to the imagination, and imagination is so rare a gift. Here, then, the writer of fiction may be of use to the public as an interpreter. A hymn by Carl P. Daw, Jr. expresses this so well. The first stanza declares, "We sing for all the unsung saints, that countless nameless throng, who kept the faith and passed it on, with hope steadfast and strong. Through all the daily griefs and joy, no chronicles record, forgetful of their lack of fame, but mindful of their Lord." The full Daw hymn is part of the conclusion of the book, One Man's Plight. There is no charge for this audio recording. It is completely free. If you desire to purchase a physical copy of the book, a Lulu link is provided below. Courteous comments are welcome. So, let's begin listening, and may the peace of the Lord be with you always. Amen. One Man's Plight by Michael L. McCoy. Chapter 1, Zechariah. Once upon a time, in the land of thorns and thistles, a young widow ascended a birthing stool. Alone in her clay house, as beads of sweat mixed with tears of grief, she panted and pushed. Although she attempted to remain quiet and do this thing without anyone knowing, her muffled grunts and huffing breaths carried out the open window of her sun-baked hut. Two dusty girls heard the young woman laboring and quietly scaled the sloped wall to stare inside the dark, one-room hut. The older girl was the third daughter of a street merchant and his wife. The girl enjoyed and took advantage of the fact that her older sisters and brother could help with the making and selling of their goods. Feigning inability and working slow enough to gain the attention of her parents, she was often sent off to occupy her time elsewhere. With such daily reinforcement of her laziness, she had time to roam freely and discover what everyone else was doing. The information she gathered was shared with others.
15 years later, she became the local gossip columnist for the news posts at the city square. At the entrance to her cubicle, she posted the following snippet. "The key to good eavesdropping is not getting caught. The Blank Book," by Lemony Snicket. After a decade of such heralding to the community, her bid for becoming the first woman elected to the city council was cut short by a sudden fever that took her life in the midnight hour of All Hallows Eve. Consequently, with such a sobering date and time stamp, her death was blamed on the shadow child. The other girl clinging to the perch at the open window was the only child of a renowned Yanker and his devoted wife. The man was credited with saving hundreds of Yankees. His wife kept an eye on others, not in the sense of snooping, but with the intent of helping with anything that might be needed, particularly by the old folk, the invalids, and the children of the city who were in need. As a result, their daughter was often sent here and there with milk, goat cheese, figs, and bread, both before and after school. This little girl was well liked and often was asked to stay and visit those people receiving these gifts, especially by the old folk. They often asked her to read to them, which she gladly did. For such occasions she carried a worn copy of Frederick Cugela's Book of Devotion, the Psalms. She used a yellowed bookmark that an old widower had given to her, and on which the aged man had scrawled, "The goats cry out no Agnus Dei, nor that ancient old creed that we say. So they cast out the hymnal, and reeled in a hurnal, as ecclesiocrats chant their OK." On occasion, she engaged in light cleaning or housekeeping. Often her free days were filled with these deliveries and acts of service and mercy, particularly with the orphan children of the street. She returned home at dusk and checked with her mother about the next day's schedule. Then she washed up, kissed her parents, sang the even song of the congregation with them, and went to bed. There she said her prayers and fell asleep quickly. In addition to her developing the desire to help others, she acquired the ability to listen to what was said, to perceive what those words meant, to understand what was truly being spoken, and to attempt to identify and clarify the speaker's motives. This would be of great benefit to her and others in the generations that followed, for she would be sorely tested. On a sunny morning, and we must remember that all mornings were sunny in those days and at that place, the paths of the two girls crossed. At that intersecting moment, they heard the sounds coming from the widow's window. They climbed the sides of the clay abode and peered into the darkness in an attempt to see who was making those sounds and what was causing them. "I think she's dying," said the older girl. The caring girl replied, "Really? Maybe she needs our help." "No one needs help dying." "Really?" "It's just natural, easiest thing in the world. My cousin and I watched a crow die. We found it on the ground, and it couldn't fly. It was injured and bleeding real bad. It hopped a few times to get away from us. Soon it just gave up and stood still. Then it fell over and died. It didn't need any help at all. If I could just see inside," the younger girl said, and began shading her eyes with one hand. "No doubt about it, that woman is dying." "I just can't see inside," she said, and then added quickly, "Wait, I know what's happening. She's as close to death as she'll ever be, but I don't think she's dying." "What?" "That is what old Rose said about women who are giving birth. That mother in there is having a baby, maybe twins." The older girl thought about who might be interested in hearing about a woman having a baby. Not many, she supposed. People were always more interested in someone's death and the details causing it. Still, there might be something that she could tell others. She said in a somewhat hopeful tone, "Maybe she'll die having the baby." This frightened the younger girl, who said, "I think she needs help. I'm going to get the midwife." The older girl replied, "Wait, let's see what's going to happen with her." Angry and afraid, the other girl declared, "No, she's not a crow, and I'm not you. I'm going to get help for her and her baby. I'll stay here. Maybe I can see her when she dies." The younger girl slid down the brown wall to the ground and started running. Her calloused feet made a rhythmic scratching sound against the sand-covered ground. She quickly disappeared into the maze of side streets and alleys. The widow inside the hut, now aware of someone waiting at her window, and hearing the slide and subsequent footfalls of the neighborhood girl, increased the efforts to deliver her baby. A newly formed fear brought forth a frantic determination, a stellar courage, and a focused self-discipline within her. She possessed an uncommon ability to set aside the pain. She compelled herself to push even between the contractions. Had she not been recently widowed and orphaned, she would have sought the comfort given by her loving husband, or the knowing hand of her mother daubing her forehead with a damp cloth. Instead, wet, stringy hair clung to her face as she pushed her child into this enlightened world of sudden evaporation, as well as the pains from punctureweed's offspring and the soul-piercing goat heads strewn about the face of this cursed landscape. The subsequent shock from her near-death experience tingled her parched mouth and generated small bursts of light in her eyes. The dry desert wind provided no relief for the mother laboring inside the fetid, stagnant air of her small, oval-shaped hut. Her head, light and dizzy, begged for unconsciousness. Her will demanded otherwise. Only rigorous concentration prevented it. She panted in short, rapid breaths when her lungs demanded oxygen. With a dry tongue and squinting eyes, she had delivered her baby just as she heard voices approaching. Motherly instinct guided her actions. Although stunned and semi-conscious, she cleared her baby's airway and grunted her relief when the infant cried. The young girl arrived at the doorway, but remained outside the thick fabric curtain until the old midwife caught up with her. When she arrived, the midwife pulled the curtain to the side and draped it over the inside hook. A flood of light would have entered the room had the shadow of the tower not darkened the young widow's hut at the moment the baby was born. The infant cries continued as the midwife approached the young woman. The new mother squatted alongside the birthing stool, caring for her baby and waiting for her body to expel the afterbirth. The midwife assisted without being asked. The young mother, having endured the great burden and thereby demonstrating her ability to finish the task, didn't prevent the midwife from helping clean up. The mother leaned back and rested as her vital signs began the long process of returning to normal. With her eyes closed, she was aware of the breathing trio around her, the strong cries of her son, the tired groans from her own throat, and the rhythmic grousing of the clean-up lady. Amid the panting from her bovine attempt at running, the grunting midwife asked the woman, "Why did you call for me? Do you want to impress me?" "I'm impressed. Only if this is your firstborn. No matter, I don't care. But listen, I'm not humored by this. I didn't have to run in order to clean up. Why did you send for me?" The older girl interrupted. "The woman didn't send for you. That little girl did. I thought we should wait. She didn't." "Yes, I did. I came for you on my own," declared the little girl defiantly. "I thought she needed help." The midwife silenced the girls with a wave of her arm and asked, "Do you have a lamp to lighten this dark hut? Since I'm here, I might as well do what I can. Where's your family?" Ignoring both the old midwife's questions and her complimentary ranting, the young widow declared in a triumphant shout to the heavens, "He shall be called Zechariah." "Whatever," responded the occupied midwife. "Now you just be still so I can at least do part of my job." The commotion attracted the nearest of neighbors. A voice from the shaded doorway objected, "But his father's name was John." 'Twas John Jerkyson. Still recovering her ordeal, the young widow firmly replied, "His name is Zechariah Jerkyson." The still small voice of the caring girl, who was standing in the darkened doorway, sounded forth. "Hello, Zechariah. I'm glad to meet you. I have a long name, and it's too hard for you to say right now. It's Elizabeth. Until you get bigger, you can just call me Ellie, okay?" The widow, speaking more to herself than anyone in her hut, whispered, "Zechariah. His name is Zechariah." Shivering from shock, she wept silently as she remembered her husband, who would not see his son in this life, and recalled her mother, who would never be summoned by the word Grandma. Mixed with and overcoming the dry tears of grief were ones of undirected anger. In defiance, she raised her eyes and lifted up her voice against all, including both the desert and the king. "His name is Zechariah." "Whatever," replied the world. So Zechariah Jerkyson was delivered into this fallen land, where young women suffer birthing pangs and old men dissolve in the dust. He took his place among the others, a struggling people who lived on a tiny plot of ground capable of growing a limited supply of fruits and vegetables. This fertile place was the only suitable spot in a sandy region where the people could live. Most called it a small city, though large town became an increasingly more accurate description, especially as its acreage was slowly decreasing. A remnant referred to it as the kingdom, because it was owned by the king. Others, coarser and more base than most citizens, called it and the king diverse names that will not be recorded here. The great desert surrounded the small city and threatened to engulf it entirely. The prevailing wind, known as the Great Northern Spirit of the Ox, was called the wind, the spirit, or the king's edict. The ox pushed the high, slow-moving sand dune into the city. The dune, taller than every building, including the lofty 3-story tower, continued to reach its sandy fingers into the city. The spirit of the ox, which was the wind, gave life to the dune. Relentless, odious, undeniable, stoic, immutable, inhuman, obdurate, and pitiless, the wind and the dune joined forces in assaulting and besieging the city and her people. Over the centuries it had invaded, overcome, consumed, and buried most of the city. It took too many lives and covered an ever-increasing portion of the precious garden and living space. The ever-advancing, always invading dune continued its invasion, threatening the remaining huts and further shrinking the limited garden space. The people of the land were stubborn and resolved to defeat the dune by removing the invading sand. The smallest men tied ropes around their waists and dug into the sand at the foot of the tall dunes, using skill and judgment to bring down small avalanches while seeking to avoid the mass movement of a large slide that could suddenly and without warning bury them alive. Occasionally, a massive shear of sand broke loose, slid down, and threatened to bury the diggers. Quick men, assigned to the other ends of the ropes, had the responsibility of keeping the diggers from being overtaken by the sand. Usually, they needed only to yank the rope and yell, because the diggers were always aware of the danger. At other times, the diggers had to be dragged out of the sand that had partially covered them and threatened to inundate them. The diggers tended to be nervous people, hence the saying among the people, "Every man is a digger on his wedding day." Everyone except the groom laughed at this saying. A subsequent humorous practice began. A day or two before the wedding, a rope was tied around the groom. As the joke continued, the groom walked around the city and sought anyone who would be willing to yank the end of his rope, thus rescuing him from his impending peril. It was rare that anyone ever yanked the rope, although there was one time when a groom named Four-Fingered Eric was about to be wed to a bartender's daughter named Helga. Eric's rope was yanked some 23 times. While 3 men truly wanted to rescue the poor man from his imminent danger, the others simply wanted him to get used to being jerked around. Helga did not consider any of this to be funny whatsoever, and began to exact a fearsome revenge on her wedding night. As for Eric, he took that night, as well as the rest of his life, in good stride, beginning with the offer of being the only digger who was willing to work without a rescue rope. When a wedge of sand spontaneously slid down the slope, the Yankees often caught up with their yankers. They would run side by side away from the fast-moving slide. The slides sometimes went 10 times farther than the height it fell. No one understood why this happened, so, like most of the unanswerable questions of the why, they blamed the king. On a day when there was a large earthquake, the dune broke loose and the resulting juggernaut buried 237 people, killing all but 14. No one laughed for several months. A year later, the sand was cleared and the ranks of Yankees and Yankers were filled. The strong men continued to pack sand during the daylight hours. They took their large canvas bags to the edge of the dune and filled them with sand. After packing them from the edge of the dune to the opposite side of the city, they dumped the sand from their canvas bags just southwest of the tower. From there, the wind blew the sand away from the town. Day after day, month after month, decade after decade, lifetime after lifetime, men packed sand. Still, the wind blew, and the dune continued to finger its way into the town, some years as much as 10 feet, but never less than 2. That is why the saying was said whenever someone died, if you could stop the wind, you could stop the dune, and if you could stop the dune, you could stop the death. The sand itself was interesting, truly taking on a persona of its own. The individual grains were spherical and of the size that made it singing sand. When the wind conditions, temperature, and humidity were just right, the sand would sing. The sound of the dune was a fluting sound that unsettled the people. They were never quite sure if the sand's song was a good omen or the sign of an impending visitation of evil. Others called it the humming of the shadow child. 5 miles to the southeast of the city coursed a dry riverbed where the clay was located that the people used to build their huts. Men with stamina carried the clay from the riverbed to the town. Once delivered, men and women added water to the clay, shaped it to the desired form, and let the hot sun bake it until the clay hardened. In these latter days, not many people packed clay from the riverbed, since very little land in the small city existed to build huts. The valuable ground became garden space because the gardens provided food. Less than 5 men with stamina packed clay from the riverbed, doing so 4 or 5 times a week. In recent times, the clay was used to construct above-ground corridors or tunnels, from the hut being covered by the dune to a domed hut further from the edge of the sand. Men also plugged the windows with the clay and let the sun bake it into stoneness. These constructions guaranteed that there would always be access to the buried huts with a series of tunnels from the outside world. For 100 years and more, this invasion of the dune was countered by this building of tunnels and new domed huts. No records were kept on how many huts were buried or how far the tunnels extended under the dune. Some said the tunnels went for many miles under the great bank of sand, and a lost city was buried under the sand. Some of the old folk spoke of large buildings now long buried, stores, feed barns, arched arenas, schools, and other large buildings. Still others maintained that this was all quite silly, and only a legend told by the old folk who wanted to impress the children. These others had no response when one of the old folk told them, "Go stand on top of the dune and measure the ox's tail." Whenever that saying was said, the old folk chuckled. No one ventured into the series of tunnels and buried huts for various reasons. First, the tunnels had become increasingly shorter, requiring anyone who wanted to venture within to crawl on hands and knees. Second, few people cared about the past. Third, the lack of light prevented them from seeing much farther than the first tunnel. There was the real danger of becoming lost in the maze of buildings. Dying in the darkness could easily happen. Besides, as some practical members of the community said, repeating an ancient saying of the people, "Don't test the tunnels unless you're dying for water." In addition, the corridors and huts were spooky. Reports of the skeletons of lost people, as well as ghosts that roam within the huts, were often reported. And besides, it was commonly held that the shadow child stayed deep inside the complex of buildings and cross-tunnels, venturing forth in the waning light of the moon. These were the things discussed in the taverns of the city and shaped the nightmares of the children. Water for people and gardens did not come from within the town or from under the dune. Since the river dried up decades earlier, an oasis 6 miles to the south-southwest became the only known source of water. Usually the water was carried in clay jugs on the heads of the women and children. A caravan left the town after dawn and returned before noon with the day's ration of water for the people, the gardens, the livestock, and the clay. The old people, who could no longer pack sand or carry water, cared for the livestock, tended to the gardens, and harvested the fruits and vegetables. They worked together and told stories from the days when they were young. The children's eyes stared in wonder as the old folk told stories about how large the city once was. "Ah," they would whisper loudly, "it's been handed down to us from our ancestors that many generations ago we lived in a great city. It's still back beyond the tunnels, but it's buried now." Even the old folks weren't sure if this was true or a legend. Perhaps it was just a story that served as a way to occupy time and conversation. A sandpacker once asked, "How many years before the sand covers all the huts and reaches the tower?" A water-bearer responded in anger, "Why would anyone ask such a question?" The sandpacker soberly answered, "So we know when the child will be born who won't die of old age." No one replied, but everyone thought about that. This was the place, that was the time, and such were the conditions when Zechariah Jerkison was born to a young widow in a clay hut under the shadow of the dune in the land of the king. In Chapter 2, Cavin. The Old Town section of Sand City had long struggled against the dune. The battle brought forth varied reactions among the people, with each reaction manifesting itself according to the demeanor of the person. Those of a generally optimistic nature were the city's cheerleaders, reporting on the fine progress made by the diggers, making plans for improving crop production, and bringing neighborhoods together. For these people, unexpected obstacles became challenges, and, as a result, such problems were called opportunities. Fellow citizens who viewed events with a generally negative attitude had a great deal of support from the facts and evidence. The construction of clay tunnels from the abandoned huts being buried by the dune to the occupied huts, which were going to be buried sooner or later, simply could not be denied. The shrinking garden space, the water measurements at the oasis, and the yearly sand projections were powerful witnesses for the pessimist club. Neither of these previously mentioned groups were increasing in membership. Indeed, it was the apathetic crowd that grew. This was understandable, since the cheerleaders didn't have much to work with but their inborn natural tendencies. Amazingly, their opposites were not growing in number either. Being a pessimist at least meant being committed to something, and for many in the city there was nothing for which a commitment could be made. In the end, there really is little difference between an unmotivated cheerleader on a losing side and a triumphant pessimist with no one willing to challenge his doomsday prophecies on the other. One dies by a broken heart, the other by a noose of his own making. The rest didn't care. At the close of one day, at the time of evensong, 3 troubling reports came from separate sections of the city. First, a respected and beloved official, a man who intensely involved himself with planning the relocation of soil from gardens threatened by the wall of sand, was found sitting in the northwestern marketplace, staring straight ahead, emotionless and silent. No coaxing could get him to speak or acknowledge the presence of other people. Members of his family took him home to his residence, where he remained stoic. It was sad and puzzling. In another report, diggers at the northern corner of Old Town were clearing a small slide that occurred in the night. About noon, the body of a man was uncovered. In his clutched hand was a note. In a scrawled script, the middle-aged man indicated he was going to trigger a slide, intending it to be large enough to kill him. It was. Finally, in the darkest section of the city, where the clay huts were but a few feet apart, a horrible discovery was made. A young woman was found dead in her home. Her neck still bore the blotchy engravings resulting from her attacker's vice-like grip. The murderer had crushed her windpipe and throttled her arteries with his massive hands. And unconsciousness gave way to death. The woman was brutally abused and beaten. People in the city were terrified and paralyzed. Apathy was the great winner in Old Town, as it slowly succumbed to the dune. Contrary to the promise of the king and the messages of his watchmen, most of the citizens, for a majority of the time, did not believe they had a future. Many parents saw no reason to guide or teach. Their children had little desire to learn. Consequently, ignorance became the inheritance passed on to the following generations. Where there is no belief in a future, a city is besieged from within, and the people are lost. Defeat brings forth hopelessness. Hopelessness leads to frustration. Fulfilled frustration spawns futility. Organic futility decays to resignation. Finally, overwhelming resignation defaults to basic primal instincts, impulses, and reactions. Here is where an unholy trinity spawns and rules: brutish ignorance, slavish fear, and survival of the fittest. A certain clay hut in a decaying neighborhood of the bored and defeated was the place where 2 people stayed. While they were husband and wife, she did not muse on her wedding day, and he couldn't recall it. So, when Darren Yankerson returned to his hut, he sat at the sand-blasted table in a semi-drunken stupor, with his eyes gazing into the void ahead of him. He said nothing. Darren tolerated the presence of his wife, Cavin, Yankee's daughter, as long as she neither approached him nor spoke to him. Violations of Darren's silent edict were swift and severe. Her face bore the marks of his punishments. When he was drunk, he would pummel her head and body with his fists. Her broken bones healed as they were, often deforming her body and always callousing her soul, which didn't heal. If she screamed or made any noise, he beat her unmercifully until she was silent, regardless of how her silence was achieved. Though Cavin hated the beatings, she believed that her existence depended on them. In her battered mind, she served a purpose, and her life had meaning. Because Darren was an ignorant man, the imposition of his will upon any and all around him took place only by physical force, and especially so with his wife. In such a time, and under such conditions, a child was conceived. As this little one developed and grew, he suffered from the hand of his father, often receiving a punch or slap in utero. The little boy felt pain at a time and in a place where no child should have to endure it, the abode of his mother's womb. So she remained silent, neither speaking to the baby as he grew within her, nor caring for him by caring for herself. While he was not conscious of the lack of his mother's love and the suffering at the brutal hands of his father, the boy's spirit was being exposed to wickedness, and his soul was being scarred by the rakes of cruelty. Then he was born. Unlike the 9 in 10 at that time who perished under such circumstances, he survived, and even thrived. Until he walked, he crawled in the gritty soil. As is the custom of crawling babies, he put anything he could into his mouth. He ate whatever he saw, and became immune to many diseases that claimed others. In a year or so, he toddled out of the place where his parents lived. They didn't care. He was a nuisance. Someone in the street gave him a name, Karen. Was this a mocking, for no one was Karen for him? One supposed that Karen was a modification of his mother's name, Karine. Another one might note the rhythmic similarity to his father's name, Darren. An older street orphan who ascended to the local child gang leader changed his name to Cavin. Cavin continued to toddle and roam about, going here and walking there. On occasion, the weariness of the days and the onset of the evening dusk required him to sleep the night in a dark corner. His parents were never concerned. If the truth be speculated, they likely preferred that he never return. Chapter 3. Plight. Beyond the northwest corner of Sand City, and adjacent to Newtown with its permanent buildings, including a university and city hall, an archaic stone structure had been built. Originally it had been Christian, but now remained so in name only. The granite walls of both the surrounding walls and the inner building were the work of stonemasons hired by divergent spiritual leaders and their followers in past generations. This cast the appearance of strict morality and an external public witness of faithfulness to Holy Writ. The women cared for orphans, not by running an orphanage, but by taking the children to their homes. The custom and practice of this lifeless stone church was that an unmarried man be placed as the high priest. That title was a bit of a misnomer, since there were no other priests. The office was appointed and transmitted by the resident high priest. Corruption followed, with each high priest manifesting said wickedness according to his individual desires. Many abused women. Others exercised power over deluded members of the rank and file. Still others invested themselves in financial matters and became moguls both within and without the religious order. None, however, were as degenerate or as debased as the present high priest, a basilisk named Archibald. He was articulate in voice and thin in physical frame. He went through the motions of the 6 daily times of Holy Writ reading and the weekly orders, when the handful of congregants gathered in the cold sanctuary. While Archibald followed the historic orders of the service, he did not deliver either a sermon or a homily. His voice was clear and icy, demonstrating neither sincerity nor compassion. He moved silently amid the shadows of the candle-lit hallways and rooms. Even though his eyes were black and bold, he stayed out of the sunlight, much preferring the darkness and hidden corners where spiders lurk and night terrors spawn. Such was his location and demeanor just after midnight, when a figure passed through the open front gate. Archibald immediately caught sight of the person crossing the courtyard. Not tall, wearing a flowing robe, a bit top-heavy. Moving quickly and yet with a certain hesitancy, the person came closer to Archibald and approached the front steps of the main building. Not top-heavy, carrying something. The high priest remained hidden and silent. He breathed shallowly and listened, a slight huffing as if one had a cold or was weeping. A woman. He strained his eyes. Not a member, no. Not anyone he knew, or any other woman he had known. Someone from out of town. She carried a burden. A baby. Archibald grinned. While he didn't know the circumstances behind her visit, he did know what was about to happen. The young woman trembled as she climbed the few steps to the main door. She tried to stifle her sobs, but was unable to do so. She approached the foundling box to the side. The mother wept, and her sobs poured forth as she put the baby in the box. What would cause a young woman to do so, to give her baby away? Some had done so out of an attempt not to embarrass themselves or their families. Others had done so because of money and a failure to be able to provide. The way she struggled and wept revealed that these were not the reasons for the abandonment of her baby. She was numb and would have done all she could to keep her little one. Yet, cradling her newborn in this foundling box was all that she could do to save her baby boy. To protect him and help him, his mother must now leave him, for he was a doppelganger, the second born of a set of identical twins. In those days, this latter-born baby was considered an evil twin and a bad omen for the family and the community. There were stories of curses on field crops, the poisoning of wells, the sterility of women, the extremes of weather, and other wretched wickedness attributed to the evilness cast by the aura of an evil twin. When such a set of twins was born, and it was discovered that they were identical twins, the youngest would always be banished, smothered, or left out in the wilderness. The second born of a set of same-sex twins would be marked in order to not mix them up. Some also marked the firstborn twin to make sure there was no mistake. It was reported that the worst plagues came upon the community when, unbeknownst to all, the second-born usurped the place of the firstborn. When it came to pass that the only way to tell the two infants apart was the mark, then the infanticide sentence was carried out. Such was the situation for this young mother of twins. She could not tell them apart without the marks. Rather than let anyone else intercede and eliminate the second baby, she took it upon herself to devise a way to let her second son live, or at least to give him a chance. It might not work, and the reality was that she would never know. This young woman traveled and remained hidden for 3 days to come to this place. The infant boy would be placed in the foundling box, and she would leave. Her plan was to return to her home and report that she journeyed into the wilderness and left her second son, which was the truth. Archibald watched her retreat from the box and descend the steps to the stone path of the courtyard. He wondered who she was. Although he had excellent eyesight in the dark and focused intently, he still did not recognize the woman. As she neared the gate, the woman hesitated and sobbed. From within her heart came the desire to run back, grab the baby, and flee into the darkness. From within her reason came the realization that she had given this infant up, and to go back would be to sentence her son to death. She would allow a part of herself to die rather than let him perish. And so it was that the doppelganger's mother faded into the double darkness of this world's night and her grieving soul. Archibald watched as she did. The baby's sounds from the foundling box drew the high priest's attention. He glanced in the direction of the infant sounds and waited. Archibald was in no hurry, wondering if perhaps the mother might return. After a quarter of an hour, she did not. Archibald listened and only heard the baby's babbling. He drew near and took the baby out of the box. The infant looked at the high priest as if inspecting him. Archibald gazed back with icy eyes. He opened the large door and entered the sanctuary with the baby grasped in his left hand. The high priest took him to a side table and unwrapped him. While the baby made no sound, he did watch the man. "Ah," said the high priest quietly, "now I understand. The words written on your back between your shoulder blades is the mark. You're an evil twin. So, let us fulfill such a prophecy. Be ready, evil twin. I have plans for you." With this, Archibald wrapped the infant in the baby's soft inner blanket and rougher outer piece of cloth. Then he picked up the bundle with his left hand and carried the little one down the 13 steps behind the stone altar. Chapter 4. Pintoc. At the northern edge of Sand City, the tower rose more than 3 stories. The slowly approaching dune stood higher. The granular glacier moved as a slow-motion tidal wave of sand, threatening to crest over, crash upon, and crush beneath it anything or anyone in its path, the tower included. The tower's footings sunk deep into the earth and secured the structure in place. This foundation prevented the great northern spirit of the ox from blowing the tower over, and would keep the dune from toppling it. Unsettled discussions arose when idle men speculated on the day when the dune encountered and pushed up against the tower. Generally, the Yankees and the Yankers insisted that the dune would prevail, while the packers and tunnel builders placed their bets on the tower. When the debate became heated and bordered on an outburst of violence between men, one of the elderly would remind them what the pious woman from the ancient years declared, namely, "Why do you contend with each other about the irresistible force meeting the immovable object? Neither of you is such a force, nor such an object. Besides, neither of you will be here when it happens." A few people laughed when this was said, but those heavily involved in the argument began grinding their teeth in vexation. Soon they went their own ways and picked up where they left off, packing and building, yanking and being yanked in a world of hurt and death. An enlarged cupola, open on all sides, permitted the watchman to stand on the 3rd floor and peer into the distance. Only the dune to the north prevented a full view of the landscape. On late afternoons, just before sunset, the slight shadows of the dry riverbed could be seen to the southeast. The oasis to the southwest was often camouflaged by heat waves and accompanying mirages. In the immediate foreground to the south, the transplanted, man-made dune grew and continued its glacial journey, always and relentlessly being urged on and moved by the parching desert wind. Beyond that, as far as the eye could see to the south, there was sand, and beyond that were the fearsome and vicious sandmen. From the western horizon to the one in the east, the watchman beheld the seasonal migrations of wandering nomads and mysterious caravans, as well as the water-bearing women and the few packers of clay. 20 feet down the ladder, from the cupola landing, was the 2nd story. Here it was that the watchman thought, hymned, read, prayed, and wrote. His living quarters were also here. Rooms were versatile and large enough to accommodate the watchman's wife and children, if indeed he had a family. Guests were received in the large front room on the cooler northern side of the tower, a place where a meal might be shared as well. A tiny spot of garden on the southeast side of the tower provided a few vegetables. The harvest from the watchman's garden supplemented the fruits and vegetables shared by others. An open balcony extended from this level in the direction of the city. From this small projection, as weather permitted, the watchman conducted the daily devotions of morn song and evensong. The ground floor of the tower is where the watchman led the services of the Holy Lord and spoke to the people about the imminent King who was transcendent, and who was also truly present with his people as he gave out his gifts of eternal life, salvation, and forgiveness by grace through faith in him. This sanctuary was large, and 200 could be in attendance. Only a small fraction of the people actually attended the weekly gatherings, and even lesser numbers at morn song and evensong. Long ago, millennia of years before the dune approached the northern edge of the great city, the king left word that a watchman was to be chosen. His edict indicated that a man be selected to live in the tower to do the necessary outward watching and the inward leading of those who gathered at the tower for the divine service, as well as for morn song and evensong. No specific method for choosing a watchman was prescribed, so There were times when the watchman died suddenly, and then the people at evensong would lament, and at mornsong a new watchman was chosen. If there was not a sudden death, and if there was time, the old watchman often made his recommendation. Whether or not the people followed the old man's counsel depended. It just depended. Too many of the people only felt that a watchman was needed for the one watching outside the congregation, to keep a constant lookout for approaching armies, in order to warn the city from the enemies without the church. These folk were simply pragmatic and only concerned themselves with an imminent king and not the imminent, eminent king. In fact, most of the population didn't believe there even was a king. Hence the saying that was said in a mocking tone, "The king is as real as the creatures in your nightmare." These unbelieving people convinced themselves and let others know that these myths about a king were simply fabrications used in self-serving maneuvers designed long ago by lazy watchmen who neither knew how nor wanted to work for a living. Thus the saying was said, "The desert vulture learned to eat by watching a watchman." When this was said, great guffaws followed. Not all people had such a low opinion of the watchman. In reality, there was a goodly number of people who loved the king and thanked him for giving them hope, for sending a faithful watchman, and for giving them the promise to be with them always, as well as return at the right time. Indeed, most of those who gathered for the services loved their watchman and appreciated the work he did among them. Like everyone in the city, they depended on his keen eye to warn them of armies on the move and dangers in the desert. However, they also depended on and appreciated his faithful service in the tower as he watched for the advent of the king and reported on the days preceding the king's majestic arrival. When such a man was their watchman, the people of the king grinned with merriment, especially whenever someone declared the old proverb, "A faithful watchman is like a loyal dog. He is always growling at the desert wolf and barking for the great king." During times when the watchman was not faithful, the proverb was spoken with sighs of longing and intercessory prayers. They prayed for a faithful watchman who barked loud and growled long. Such a servant was of those breed of men who think with the mind and proclaiming the word of God. At evensong, during the penitential season of Advent, the faithful sang to the watchman, and he replied to the pilgrims, "Watchman, tell us of the night, for the morning seems to dawn. Traveler, darkness takes its flight, doubt and terror are withdrawn. Watchman, let thy wandering cease, hie thee to thy quiet home. Traveler, lo, the Prince of Peace, lo, the Son of God is come." From his early days, Pintoc desired to become a watchman. As a boy, Pintoc listened more than he talked, imagining how a particular event might be perceived from various perspectives. Though young, inexperienced, and unaware of the complete range of emotions and feelings due to a person's age, sex, personality, genetics, circumstances, and position, Pintoc watched people and thought about what they might be thinking and feeling, about what they believed and why, and what caused one to react one way while another person did the opposite. Once, when Pintoc was 8 years old, a sand slide killed a Yankee. Pintoc was a friend of the man's son, and they often played together. At the funeral, Pintoc watched the people. As he focused on each individual in turn, he thought about what that person was thinking, feeling, and believing. He looked at his friend and thought how the death of the man was perceived by his son. His eyes shifted to the man's wife. Pintoc tried to determine what differences there were between the wife's grief and his friend's sorrow. He looked away from the huddled mass and saw a man standing by himself, leaning on the handle of a shovel and waiting. Pintoc tried to imagine what the death of his friend's father meant to the man with the shovel, a man waiting impatiently for the service to be over so he could bury the coffin, collect his wages, and go home. As he stood at the gravesite, the young boy heard a loud voice from the distant market behind him, as he wondered if the owner of the voice knew of the man's death. Then he watched a packer plodding along the bone-dry desert with his burden of clay. What was it that would cause the grief of the widow to far exceed the grief of that packer at the death of this one man? Pintoc thought about a hill of sand ants he once discovered. In the midst of the organized chaos, a dead ant was being carried from one place to another, passing from one ant to another. Did the human widow and the dead ant's wife have anything in common? Did the ants feel differing degrees of grief? Did they feel? How did the ants view him? From their perspective, was he a giant or was he the king? The youthful Pintoc not only thought about those involved in death, weddings, births, and other dramatic events in this world, but also about seemingly insignificant everyday affairs. Mentally, he examined the viewpoints and consequences of the teacher of letters, who tended to a tiger lily as if caring for a child. He pondered a basket of vegetables stolen from the old woman with the humped shoulder, and a small girl standing at the edge of the desert with her little brother. Then there was the city's crazy man muttering to himself as he walked. He thought about the calm man who cursed the king, and the family preparing to abandon their clay home within the next year because of the great spirit of the ox. And there were many others, the unique laughing of the barking watchman's kind wife, an older teen proudly sporting a black eye, the quiet woman who stuttered when she spoke, the happy child who limped, the angry voices of a man and a woman who argued at midnight, the dusty and tear-stained face of a nubile maiden with the clay water jug, the stoic man who smiled one evensong. Then Pintoc considered his own place in all of these scenes. He wondered if other people walked around thinking about the same things, looking at Pintoc and imagining his perspective in these matters. Over time, adjustments and corrections are made in one's viewpoint. As one becomes less of a child and more of a man or a woman, things are lost and others acquired. Hormones change gradually over months. Experiences can do the same, but they are also capable of changing a young man in a few hours. Pintoc's father became plagued by a consuming disease and died in agony after several days. Now Pintoc better understood how his friend felt when his friend's digger father was killed. At the funeral of his own father, Pintoc's eyes gazed upon the sand at his feet, and many tears flowed down his cheeks and fell to the ground. His tears were no match for the hot sand. Even at such a time, Pintoc wondered what his mother was feeling, wondered if his friend was watching him, and wondered how many sets of eyes were staring at him. Pintoc's thoughts turned to his father, who, from his son's perspective, had always been a packer, and Pintoc wondered if his father was ever a boy too. He wondered what he thought about when his father was a boy, and if he thought about things at all. Then Pintoc wondered why he had never asked his father about this and that, and 1,000 more things besides. More tears dropped to moisten a tiny spot of sand at the boy's feet, but they were quickly consumed by the evaporation of this world. Pintoc's father had been a clay packer, as was his father before him and his before him. Packers made 2 trips a day, and the young boy often walked along to the old riverbed with his father in the morning trip. He stayed at the clay site with his grandfather until returning to the city with the evening load of clay with his father, the father with a large pack, the son with a small one. After his father's death, Pintoc began to pack clay. He was strong enough to do the job. It was now the time in his life to take up the work of his father, though he wasn't necessarily aware of it. One day he learned it was so, for his grandfather told him that this was his duty now. He discovered the reality of it when he walked out to the dry riverbed with his small pack, and was told he would return with the large pack his father used. He struggled as he shuffled along, the other packers far ahead of him. Pintoc met them as they began their return trip to the city. They with empty packs, he with a full one. As in former days, and when they had opportunity, he often sat in the shade with his grandfather. The two of them remained together in each other's presence, neither one speaking, both thinking. An hour later, the old man stood to stretch his legs. Pintoc looked up and asked, "Grandfather?" The old man answered by turning his head down and to the left side where the young man sat. "Grandfather, is the grief of a father the same as the grief of a son?" The old man could not answer with his voice. The young man noted his grandfather's tears falling and being absorbed into a tiny patch of clay. Pintoc thought that their grief was the same, while also being different. A few minutes later, the grandfather breathed heavily and replied, "Grandson?" The young man answered by turning his head up and to the right side where the old man stood. "No, 'tis not the same. Methinks one 'tis worse. Now, over there 'tis a man's pack loaded with clay. Take it to the city, and return here this afternoon for your second load. When you come back, you must tell me which 'tis worse, and why 'tis so." Pintoc obeyed, and thought as he did so. In the late afternoon he returned and gave the answer to his grandfather. The old man smiled because the young man thought out the reason. After Pintoc explained why the one grief was just a smidgy less than the other, the grandfather placed the overloaded pack of clay on the young shoulders and told him to go home. Under the stars of the desert sky, Pintoc recalled that the king also knew what it was to lose a father and a son, one by abandonment, the other by death. If he ever had the opportunity, Pintoc believed he might ask the king which hurt the most. Then, after further reflection, Pintoc thought he would not ask. He was uncertain what the king's reaction might be. The young packer decided to think more on these matters. All this was beneficial to Pintoc, as well as to those around him, for he would become the watchman in less than a decade. Chapter 5, Cavin. Dune City, which was called Doomed City by many, was the regional seat and one of the secondary hubs for commerce. It had transitioned from hub to destination in the last few decades as the sand filtered into the neighborhoods in the north. The attitudes of the people changed as well. The healthy trinity of life, liberty, and opportunity became more of an unholy alliance of choice, license, and coercion. The promotion of selective tolerances advanced the agendas of those who sought the favor of the people. But in reality, this simply enabled them to be in power and accumulate more. These power brokers passed and enforced laws and programs that made the people more reliant on the government and less likely to have any initiative to advance themselves, their families, or the city. The administrations of those in office became intolerant of those who opposed them. While the opposition sought the truth and tried to deal in and with integrity, honor, and honesty, they were in the minority and were viewed as old-fashioned and rigid. They were called bigots, racists, and haters. The truth-tellers sighed, and one often heard them say, "This is the doomed city." To this, other truth-tellers replied, "Yes, but it is my city, and I will fight for her, life, liberty, and opportunity." To this, the administrators smiled and replied, "Indeed, shout all you want. Time is not on your side. You and your kind and your old ways are dying out. The young are arising." Thus far the second infiltration of Dune City. The third was from the Sandmen. Hundreds of Sandmen families came from the south and began living in the city. Many sought friendship, acceptance, and the opportunities that came in their new residency. These were honorable and became valuable members of society. But with these people came those who sought the downfall of the city. Spies, fearmongers, and moles blended in the communities, especially in the places of worship of their God. The city administrators downplayed the threat and explained away their lack of planning and action. The Sandmen continued to cross the borders and seep into the city. It was at this time that some began calling the city Sand City. In an isolated street, a boy watched for a chance to steal a bit of food to eat or a trinket to trade. He was a poor boy of the streets, whom we know as the aforementioned Cavin. He was not loved, and therefore learned not to have any regard or affection for anyone else, except for little children. He had an above-average intelligence, and was able to manage and manipulate his way in his world of eat or be eaten. Cavin ate, for the alternative was to die. He opted for life, as we all do. The boy learned to use distractions in order to steal food from a baker's cart, or grab some item from a storekeeper, or both. Once, when a fire broke out in a sheep pen and everyone's attention was drawn to it, Cavin took 2 sweet rolls and a key from the nearby bakery. He ate the rolls and kept the key, wondering what it might be for. Another time, he used a fight in the street to lift a box of spices. The shopkeeper snagged him, and Cavin threw the box with its contents at him. The boy escaped with a bruised arm and a spiteful promise of a vengeful return. He was overtly defiant and always at the brink of an angry outburst leading to violence. Cavin was without a conscience and on his way to becoming a sociopath. Cavin also battled with older street marauders who preyed on him and on the younger children. On one occasion, an older boy beat the younger Cavin, leaving him bloody and with bruised ribs. To add insult to injury, he also took the younger boy's recently snagged pliers, hammer, and shirt. As Cavin lay bleeding in the sandy dirt of the side street, he watched the older boy strolling away. Cavin vowed a repayment. He plotted and planned a scheme to do just that, watching and noting the path taken by the ruffian and noting his pattern of life. While Cavin exercised remarkable patience, this was only in the service of a plotted revenge. A plan began to evolve as he noted times, places, and movements. He checked for the movements of other people in the area of the impending attack. He rehearsed it 10 times and made minor changes to the scheme. Finally, he was satisfied and set the plan in motion. Cavin hid along the side of the street. He strung a thin tripwire from the bottom row of oranges on a large fruit stand. He waited. The ruffian was approaching. The fruit stand owner saw the ruffian coming and moved into a position where he could be seen. The owner gripped his broom as if it were an unpadded pugil stick. The owner's son stepped over to the other end of the fruit stand and glanced sideways. The ruffian saw both of them. If they had not been there, he would have stolen some fruit. He determined to walk past them without attempting anything. Cavin watched and waited. Timing was everything. He breathed slowly and concentrated. As the ruffian walked by the stand, Cavin pulled the wire and released the pyramid of oranges. They fell at the ruffian's feet and into the street. The fruit stand owner was enraged. Cursing and yelling, the man and his son rushed the ruffian. The owner jabbed him in the small of the back and threw him face down to the ground. The father straddled him while the son held the ruffian's head down and yelled into his ear. Unnoticed by anyone, Cavin moved in, and with his keenly sharpened knife, he swiftly severed the Achilles tendons on both of the lad's legs. The ruffian screamed and struggled fiercely, causing the owner and his son to focus more attention and exert more force on him to keep him down. Cavin used the opportunity to take the ruffian's drop satchel. He quickly departed and slipped into the dark alley. There he waited for anyone who might follow him. No one did. Cavin left and awaited a place where he could inspect the cache of items within the satchel. He hissed in the darkness, "Payback plus."